Today we're going to be looking at the French Empire from 1450 to about 1763. We got to look at French society and how it existed in the year 1450 and how feudalism was really kind of coming to an end, and you're going to have a more centralized state take place. This was a trend that we see all throughout Europe during this time period. But we're going to look specifically at the French and really how their domestic policies kind of influenced their overseas policies as far as foreign expansion goes. To really get a grasp on where the French were coming from at the beginning of this time period, we really need to look at the Protestant Reformation and what that really caused in France. Now, Martin Luther is going to start the Protestant Reformation in the early 1520s, but by the time you get to the mid-1500s, Protestantism has spread throughout Northern Europe. And so when we look at France specifically, we see a divided society in the early 1500s. A minority of the population were French Protestants, or Huguenots, as we call them. And the actual monarchy was Catholic. That's the royal house of Valois. And so basically you have this substantial Huguenot minority in France fighting with the established Catholic majority. But the Huguenots were a pretty substantial minority within France. Now, from about 1562 to 1598, we're going to have what's called the French Wars of Religion. And it's basically sectarian violence between Huguenots and Catholics in France. There's a series of kings that come to the throne in France that are too young or not really intelligent, and they aren't very good rulers. And basically the French society, by the time you get to the 1590s, is in total chaos. These French wars of religion are not going to end until 1598, when Henry IV, also known as Henry Navarre, becomes Henry IV of France, and puts an end to the French wars of religion. Most notably by issuing the Edict of Nantes, which basically granted religious freedom to everybody in France. So it's at 1598 that we see France finally getting their domestic issues under control, and then we start to see this growth of this great overseas empire. During the French Wars of Religion, we see attempts by Huguenots to establish overseas colonies in North and South America at this time. The reason for this was for religious freedom. They wanted to leave France, come to the New World, much like the Pilgrims had done, or will do, at Plymouth Rock in 1620. So these Huguenots came to the New World looking for that religious freedom. They were trying to escape all the violence that they were dealing with in their homeland. A couple examples that we have is they tried to establish colonies in South America, also along the coast of modern day Carolinas. A couple of attempts for forts were established. But the most notable one is probably Fort Caroline, which was established in 1564 on the banks of the St. Johns River right here in Jacksonville, so right down the road. So this was established by French Huguenots in an attempt to, again, have religious freedom and have a Huguenot colony in the New World. But as you guys know, St. Augustine, not too far down the road, was occupied by the Spanish, was a Spanish colony. So the Spanish, who were staunchly Catholic, did not want French Huguenots settling, 30 miles away from them. So what we have is this French fort was established right on the banks of the St. Johns. The Spanish in St. Augustine catch wind of this, and so they make an attempt to snuff out the French, to get rid of them. So an expedition is actually led overland from St. Augustine to Fort Caroline by the Spanish to have basically a surprise attack and take the French fort. And the Spanish went overland. This small Spanish force went overland. Took 2 days to get to Fort Caroline from St. Augustine. All the while it was raining, horrible conditions, nothing but swampland, mosquitoes, no way to get dry. And when the Spanish finally reached Fort Caroline, the French weren't even paying attention. They had their guard down, basically. And so the Spanish charged and took the fort pretty easily. A number of French that were left fled into the woods or fled onto boats that were anchored off the St. John's, out in the St. John's River. But to make a long story short, this kicks the French out of Florida, and it remains in Spanish hands until 1763. I'm sorry, 1783. But it's kind of, you see these attempts though for religious freedom from these Huguenots. Now, what you have from 1598 onward until you get to the French Revolution is really a strengthening of the French state. The feudal system, by the time you get to the 1500s, is kind of being dismantled by various stronger monarchs. And feudalism, guys, as you probably know, is a really a form of decentralized government. The authority is always with the king in theory, but the nobles and the nobility become very, very wealthy and powerful oftentimes. So what we're going to see here with a series of French kings, starting with Henry IV, is this centralization of power taking place. A lot of them are going to start to weaken the nobility, to undermine the power of the nobility. And you're just going to see this power being vested in the king, in one person. So you also see an increase in different various taxes under these monarchs, most notably tariffs to increase royal coffers. And so you see these monarchs garnish a tremendous amount of wealth. And you're not really going to have a French empire being able to exist domestically and overseas unless you have a strong centralized authority. So what we also have here during the 16 and 1700s is this concept of divine right. Now, if you become king, you need to have a way to make your rule legitimate. You can't just say, I'm king, and that's it, and you guys are all going to follow me. You have to have some kind of way to make it legitimate. So the way they did it was this concept of divine right, meaning that God made you king. I am king because I was born to be king. God put me there. So in a way, it's close to the idea of the mandate of heaven, a little different. It's got a European twist to it, but it's still this idea that we got to have this political legitimacy, even with these monarchs and these royal families that have been in power for a very long time. As you see in the pictures here, we got Henry IV on the left. He, as I mentioned earlier, becomes king in 1598, ends these French wars of religion. And he's most noted for the Edict of Nantes in 1598, which gave religious freedom to the Huguenots in France. So that was a big breakthrough for religious rights, if you would, in Europe at the time. In the middle, you got Louis XIII, and then on the far right, Louis XIV. They went in that order, actually. So with Louis XIII and XIV, you're going to see an increase in this trend of centralization of political authority. Louis XIV, also known as the Sun King, is going to be the epitome of an absolute monarch. He's going to rule over France pretty straightforward from Versailles, his great palace at Versailles, which is about 11 miles outside the city of Paris. So Louis XIV is going to be completely in control of the country. But one thing he does by the time he's done with his reign is he's bankrupted his country. He spends a lot of money on wars on the mainland continent of Europe and basically bankrupts his country by the time he dies. But he still builds this great French empire, even though France by the time he dies is pretty much broke. Now, as stated previously, early attempts at colonization of North America by the French failed, with the Spanish taking Fort Caroline and other colonial attempts failing in South America. However, by the time we get to the early 1600s, we're going to see the French start to establish permanent colonies in what is today Quebec. So if you look at the map that's on the slide here, the blue area by 1650 would be considered New France. And so the earliest of these settlements, or one of the earliest, is Quebec City, which was founded by Samuel de Champlain in the early 1600s. And from there, he goes upriver, or the French went upriver to Montreal, and then eventually reaching the Great Lakes. And if you can see from the map here, we got a number of different forts and settlements in the Great Lakes region reaching as far as Manitoba in the west. And if you look at the map again, you can see that using the Great Lakes is kind of like a highway. The French made it through the Great Lakes into the Ohio River Valley and into the Mississippi River Valley, reaching as far down south as New Orleans. So you see this huge expanse of territory that the French now control, or at least they claim they controlled. A lot of these claims that were made at this time, guys, was not necessarily always credible. For example, the British, claimed in the Massachusetts colony and in the Virginia colony that they controlled all the land from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. So a lot of these old colonial claims don't really mean anything. But the French did a pretty good job at establishing different forts along the different trade routes in New France. So it's a pretty good chunk of territory and takes up a lot of the different modern-day American states. But one thing we got to look at, the reason for the French establishing all these trade contacts in New France is the fur trade. Beaver pelt in particular is very valuable. So the French would go out and catch beaver and sell it for a very high price. So it's going to be a pretty lucrative trade. So that's going to be the motivation for this, for sure. But looking at New France, by the time you get to the year 1700, even though it was doing well in some of the more urban centers like New Orleans or Quebec City or Montreal, it was still very underpopulated. When we compare New France to the British colonies on the East Coast, like Massachusetts and Virginia, the British colonies had a very high population. The British were settling in the East Coast colonies in large numbers. And a lot of those British that were coming to the New World were planning on staying. They planned to buy land and farm and stay. So a large number of them were pouring in. The French colonies, or the French colony of New France, on the other hand, had a low population. And this started to alarm Louis XIV when he was looking at how many people the British had living in their colonies on the East Coast and how little he had. So he actually encouraged women from the age of 17 to 35 to go to France and find husbands that were already there. And his thinking was that they can get married and reproduce and have more French people in New France. But that was called the King's Daughters, if you see in the picture down there, as an attempt to really kind of boost the population of New France. And one thing we're going to see here also is the British and the French in North America playing the Native American tribes off each other, trying to gain a foothold, trying to gain allies. So, if you see on the map over here, guys, it's only a matter of time before these major overseas empires, these European empires, are going to butt heads over different colonies. So that's where we're kind of at with that. Now, as kind of mentioned previous, the fur trade is going to be the big motivating factor for a lot of French coming over to New France. That's going to be their main resource that they're going to want to acquire. Another major resource that was kind of seen as this will be the future of New France was the production of maple syrup. There were some who thought that New France could produce enough maple syrup it could be just as valuable as sugar cane in the Caribbean. So they had some ideas for how they could make money. But again, the fur trade is going to be pretty substantial and consistent in bringing them in money. So if you saw the map on the other page, guys, the French are going to use rivers and streams and the Great Lakes and what have you as inland highways, and they're going to establish a lot of trade contacts with the Native Americans. Now, the native peoples living in the regions, such as the Erie tribe or the Wyandots, the Huron, just to name a couple, would oftentimes go out and catch beavers or other animals on their own and then exchange the beaver pelt to the French for trade goods that the Native Americans couldn't get, guns, alcohol, clothing, stuff like that. So, the New France is pretty much what we're going to be looking at is the fur trade. So, that's what's making the money there. So the French, on top of that, established a series of forts in the area along the rivers to hold on to their claims, basically. Um, and they're also going to play Native American tribes off each other to gain the upper hand a little bit. There was something called the Beaver Wars in the early 1600s that pretty much wiped out a number of tribes in the Great Lakes region, um, for the purpose that the French having their Native American tribes, their allies in the area, so the fur trade for them could continue. So that's what we're going to see happen here in the interior of North America at the time. Now, another area that we look at for the French overseas empire in the Americas has to be the Caribbean. Um, the Caribbean islands, even though they're small in territory, or small in land area, a lot of them, are going to be immensely valuable to European powers at this time. The British, the French, the Spanish are all going to vie for control over these different islands. And the reason for this is, or main reason for this is sugar production. The two French islands that I'm going to mention are Saint-Domingue, which is modern-day Haiti, and Martinique. These are pretty small islands when we're comparing it to, say, New France or Canada, but they're going to be very valuable to the French for the fact that they can produce sugarcane, which from that they can take sugar from and make a ton of money. So basically, sugarcane, if you look at the picture to the left there, is a pretty labor-intensive crop. It grows as a tall cane, and basically you have to go out and cut it, and it's pretty labor-intensive. It's sharp. The leaves on it are sharp. After that, it has to be hauled to a mill where it gets cooked down, and the syrup is collected and then dried out, and then you get somewhat of a granulated form of sugar that gets pressed into a sugar cone at the time. So basically, it's a pretty labor-intensive crop that we're looking at, this cash crop here. But the payoffs are tremendous. The French planters on these islands, like Saint-Domingue and Martinique, that own the land that are producing this sugar, are making a ton of money. These French planters in the Caribbean have wealth that oftentimes rivals the nobility back in France. So it's a tremendously profitable thing to get involved in. However, the downside to this is the fact that it is so labor intensive. So a lot of these French planters look to find cheap sources of labor to produce the sugar cane, and they turn to African slaves from West Africa. So a number of Africans are going to be brought to the New World as slaves to work on these plantations. So if you look at the bottom picture, that's kind of what we're seeing with a lot of these slave ships that took slaves to the New World. Very cramped and horrible conditions on board, and many of them didn't make it. And Saint-Domingue, for example, the conditions for the slaves were so horrible that it was expected that a slave would maybe last a year and a half before they were basically worked to death, died of sickness or disease or malnutrition, and then the slave owner would simply import more African slaves. So there was a high death rate for African slaves in the Caribbean, more so than other places for sure. So this want for sugar in Europe and in other places is going to create this horrible institution that existed at the time. Now, oftentimes what we see with these sugar islands in the Caribbean is that when European powers would fight, a European power would take, like the British would take Martinique, for example. This actually happened. And then they would barter when they were at peace negotiations for the island back. So if the French wanted Martinique back, they would have to barter with the British, to do it, and the British would want something out of it. So maybe the British would want another territory from the French, or they would simply want money, or what have you. But oftentimes that happened in the wars that you saw during this century, during the 1700s, because all the European powers knew how valuable these islands actually were. Now, it was only a matter of time before the two major powers in North America, that's Britain and France, kind of came to heads and blows. And basically what you're going to have from the year 1688 until 1815 is basically on and off fighting constantly between the British and the French. Some historians like to call this the Second Hundred Years' War, because if you look at it, I mean, there was just constant wars, struggling over overseas territories, wars of revolution and what have you. But we're going to have basically constant fighting. So when we look at the wars between the British and the French, if you see over there on the right, them kicking off in 1688, we have what's called the 9 Years' War. And then next to it, there's another name for the war, and that's King William's War. And basically what you have with these wars that took place in the late 1600s and all through the 1700s is two different names. You got a European name, or what it's called in Europe when we're talking about it, and you got what the Americans were calling it, what they were calling it in the colonies. So King William's War would be what they would have been calling it in the colonies. And basically what they, if you can see from there, what they did is basically they named the war after whoever was in charge, whoever was king or queen of England at the time. So the 9 Years' War was King William's War between the French and the British. The War of the Spanish Succession was known as Queen Anne's War in the colonies. The War of the Austrian Succession was known as King George's War in the colonies. And basically what you have from the 9 Years' War until King George's War is the British and the French duking it out in North America, and there's minor territorial loss. At one point, the British captured Quebec, and then through treaty negotiations, gave it back to the French. So, wars of the 1700s were like that. They weren't total war. The British or the French were not out to annihilate each other. At no time during any of these wars were the British planning on marching on Paris and exterminating all the French that they could find. We see that in the 20th century with the Second World War, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union and they saw them as subhuman and wanted to basically wipe them out. Wars in the 18th century were not like that. For the first time, we have armies reaching substantial numbers, large standing armies in France especially, and those armies are expensive. So nobody really wanted to go and use all their, basically risk their entire military on an engagement with the enemy. So what they would do is they would have limited battles or limited fighting. So nobody wanted to risk losing everything because that's expensive and what have you. So if you went to war back then, basically you would want to fight a limited battle. If you won that battle, you would then use that as kind of leverage in the peace negotiations, whenever that might be. So it's a different style of fighting than what we see in modern times. Oftentimes if an army surrendered to the enemy, if a French army surrendered to the British army, the two commanders would meet in the middle of the field. They'd exchange compliments, saying things like, you've done a very good job defending your fort. The fort probably would have fallen a lot sooner if you weren't such a skilled commander. So they were, really polite with each other. And oftentimes if an army surrendered, the commander who was victorious would basically say, hey, just lay down all your guns and lay down your colors, and you guys can go home, as long as you promise not to fight in this war anymore. So it's pretty common to see stuff like that occur. But by the time we get to the 7 Years' War, which is known as the French and Indian War from 1756 to 1763, this is going to be the end of the French Empire basically in North America. Now, it takes place outside the time period because we ended in 1750, but it's a pretty important thing to cover, simply because we've been talking about the French Empire. So basically what happened during the 7 Years' War is, not the 7 Years' War. Basically, when we're looking at the French and Indian War in North America, the area that is modern-day Pittsburgh is right on the border between British colonial territory and French colonial territory, and basically that was the contested area. So you're going to see this war start in North America, and at first the French are going to have a series of pretty stunning victories against the British. But to make a long story short, we're going to have the British take Quebec City and a few other pretty intense victories, and they're going to end up winning the war in 1763. So this war ends with the Treaty of Paris and basically a cession of all French lands in North America. Now, once the French lost the French and Indian War, all of New France was surrendered to the British. The French maintained their colonies in some of the sugar islands like Saint Domingue, but basically it was a huge blow to the overseas French Empire. So basically what you're going to see, guys, is an overseas French Empire not existing, really, until you get to the 1870s, when we have a second wave of European imperialism taking place. And we're going to see then the French and the British and the Germans start to colonize Africa and Asia. So it's kind of interesting to look at these European powers and how they built these overseas empires. With this first wave of imperialism that we're looking at, with empire building with these European states, the British, the French, the Portuguese, the Spanish, what we have is these guys establishing colonies mainly in North and South America. And then by the end of the 1700s into the early 1800s, a lot of these colonies in North and South America are going to declare independence, most notably the United States, Haiti, Argentina, just to name a couple. So basically what you're going to have is, by the time you get to the 1870s, European powers looking elsewhere for markets, for overseas markets and overseas territories to exploit. So the focus that we have with Europeans in the second wave of imperialism is Asia and Africa, mostly. So, but this also establishes the dominance of the British Empire at this time. So after 1763, the British Empire reaches its height during its first stage of empire, not the second. So basically, there's going to be a blow to that with the American Revolution, in which the French help. But all this is going to change when we get to the French Revolution for sure, and there's a whole change in the structure of French society and oftentimes a lot of European societies. So it's kind of interesting to look at how we see this growth of this French Empire, how it influenced North America, Canada, and other places. So it's kind of interesting to look at, and we should take note.